It's finally here. After a 2-year wait, Hollywood strikes, internal strife, restructuring, and a heap of negative fan backlash, Rings of Power Season 2 has arrived. And right away, they've proven they've learned nothing from the failure of Season 1. We start with a flashback of Adars' betrayal of Sauron. This was mentioned a couple of times in the first season, but now we actually get to see it. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Sauron, played by Jack Lowden, the other actor portraying the character, is addressing the survivors of the last Great War. After Morgoth's defeat, Sauron is attempting to rally troops under his new leadership. He does this by giving a little speech with his vision about subjugating all of Middle-earth. He tells them that a lot of orcs are going to die as a result. Honestly, I don't even understand why he would say this. I mean, telling your troops that haven't even sworn fealty to you yet that you're going to sacrifice a bunch of them isn't very smart. I mean, Shrek did this as a joke.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
Sauron should be smart enough not to lead with his plans of using the orcs as disposable foot soldiers. But he isn't. And Adar, who we've already established cares about the plight of the orcs, doesn't want them thrown away as cannon fodder. So he betrays Sauron. Instead of crowning him with this evil spiky crown, Adar turns it upside down and stabs Sauron with it. Then, for no apparent reason, every orc in the room decides to turn on Sauron, and they all take turns stabbing him to death. It is evident to me that they were trying to copy the scene from Game of Thrones, where Jon Snow is betrayed and then stabbed to death by the members of the Night's Watch. But while Game of Thrones built to this moment over the course of a whole season, this just happens, and it robs it of much of its impact. Next, when Adar kicks Sauron's ventilated body to make sure he's dead, Sauron arches his back and lets out a scream, and then a blast wave of cold goes out in all directions, freezing the palace and all the land around it. Why? Don't know, but it seems like this is the stronghold that Galadriel and her troops found at the beginning of Season 1. As Adar and his orcs get back to their feet, because though the palace and the land around it were frozen, it didn't seem to hurt any of them at all. But as they get back to their feet, they see Sauron's body is gone. Just a pile of clothes remain, and a bunch of black liquid which pours through the cracks in the floor, down to a cavern below the stronghold. And there it coalesces into a pool of black goop. And then we see the goop pull in and eat a rat and some bugs. It becomes a bad CG goop monster that slowly slithers its way out of the cavern and back out into the world, until it gets to a road, climbs on a passing cart and eats the driver. And then, shock and awe, the slime monster is able to take human form, and it's Charlie Vickers Sauron. Again, there's no context for any of this. No explanation of how or why Sauron can do any of this. We're just supposed to go along with it. New Sauron stumbles his way along until he encounters a group of refugees, fleeing from Adar and his orcs as they start messing with the Southlands. And after a horrendously forced conversation with an old man, Sauron is persuaded to go with the refugees and seek out a new life. They don't get very far though, as the ship they board is attacked by a giant sea creature. Yes, the same one that's in Season 1, which destroys the ship and leaves the survivors on floating wreckage. This, of course, wraps back around to the meeting of half-drowned Galadriel in the middle of the sea. And you know, I feel like I've seen this before. It reminds me a lot of the opening of Finding Dory, the way the second film started on Dory and traced her backstory to the moment she met Marlin in the first movie. And it's here you begin to realize that the writers of Rings of Power have taken a lot of their ideas from animated family films and HBO shows. But that isn't the biggest problem with this opening sequence. The problem is that it exists at all. It retreads stuff that we already know from Season 1, and while it attempts to fill in some of the gaps, it doesn't add anything that might change or enhance our understanding. However, it is an attempt to influence our emotional perspective. They want us to begin empathizing with Sauron and Adar. They want these characters to be morally complicated, with understandable motivations. Seeing Sauron betrayed by those he once trusted is designed to elicit a sympathy response from us, but it's sympathy for the devil.
Please allow me to introduce myself.
The writers of Rings of Power misunderstand the lore and world Tolkien created, the dynamics of good and evil, but I'm going to talk about that more later, as this will be a problem that permeates much of this season. Next, we cut to a chase sequence. Galadriel is pursuing Elrond on horseback, charging through woods and fields. Why, you ask? Well, apparently Elrond took the 3 rings Celebrimbor forged at the end of last season, and ran off with them. How did he do this? When? How long did it take Galadriel to find out, and has she been chasing him all the way from the forge in Eregion? We don't know, because the show doesn't bother to tell us. I mean, who needs details when you have an action chase sequence? For all her efforts, Galadriel isn't able to stop Elrond before he reaches High King Gilg Glad, and what follows is equally the most entertaining and most infuriating sequence in Rings of Power thus far. Elrond has reached Gilg Glad and explained that not all is well. Galadriel has been less than honest with them.
Elrond just informed me your companion, this Halbrand, was not who he claimed, yet you chose to withhold this from him and Celebrimbor.
Gilg Glad comes down on Galadriel pretty hard, and forces her to tell the truth about Halbrand's true identity. Actually, I really like this part of the scene, watching Galadriel get chewed out over her manipulations. twisting under the scrutiny and forced to come clean was cathartic after the way the first season ended.
Now who is this man?
He's Sauron.
And now the truth is out. The king and Elrond know that Sauron has returned. They know that thanks to Galadriel, he's already been in their midst and exerted influence over them. Gilg Glad is rightfully angered by Galadriel's attempts to hide it and seems ready to punish her. But when a show like this rises to new heights, it's only to plummet off of them to reach new lows. And here the scene turns from being one of the best to one of the worst. In desperation of getting Gilg Glad's focus off her, Galadriel tells the king that Elrond is carrying the newly forged rings. The rings they hope will solve the light dying problem. And her gambit works. Gilg Glad suddenly turns all his focus to Elrond and the rings. Elrond protests that they shouldn't trust the rings because Sauron's influence may have already tainted them, a concern that the king and Galadriel dismiss out of hand. Gilg Glad and Galadriel side by side demand Elrond turn them over. Now this is framed as an act of desperation. Gilg Glad maintains that because of the light of the Eldar dying, the elves will have to leave Middle-earth, and leave it to Sauron, which he isn't willing to do. So they will have to use the rings because they have no other hope of restoring the light of the Eldar. But consider for a moment that Gilg Glad doesn't know what's causing the light to fade. He doesn't know if the rings will solve the problem. And with Sauron's return, only one thing is sure, that he is somehow involved in all of this. So given all that, Elrond's objections make a lot of sense.
High King, Sauron has not yet amassed that degree of power. These rings may be how he attains it.
His call to proceed cautiously should resonate with someone as intelligent and as wise as Gilg Glad. But for some reason I can't figure out. Gilg Glad decides to forget Galadriel's actions and joins with her to treat Elrond as a new enemy. Disregarding the danger, they order Elrond to surrender the rings. And to his credit, Elrond does not, instead pitching himself off a cliff and into a river to escape. And somehow he makes it to another location. Elrond is seeking out Círdan. According to Tolkien's lore, Círdan the Shipwright is an incredibly wise elf with a gift of foresight. So of course in Rings of Power, he's nothing of the sort, merely a red herring. See, after Elrond meets with Círdan and explains everything to him, the wise elf agrees that the rings should be destroyed, because of the potential threat they pose, or at least they should be put somewhere out of reach. Meanwhile, Gilg Glad writes a letter warning Celebrimbor that his former partner Halbrand is actually Sauron. The king sends off the letter with a messenger, telling of its utmost urgency. Of course, eventually Galadriel figures out where Elrond is gone, and she attempts to confront him again. And again, I like this scene. Elrond makes his case and levels some appropriate criticisms at Galadriel for her actions, saying some things that we the audience have been saying.
Sauron looked inside you and plucked the very song of your soul, note by note. You gave him everything he wanted and then thanked him for it.
But when pressed about the rings, Elrond says he doesn't have them anymore. Círdan does, taking them in a rowboat out into the water, where a scar from a battle with Morgoth left a chasm, the depths of which are unknown. Círdan plans to pitch the rings into the chasm, but whether you know the lore or not, you can probably guess what happens next. As he prepares to throw the rings away, he gets a glimpse of one. In another scene pulled from the Jackson movies, Círdan can't bring himself to destroy them. He returns to the king wearing one of the three. Gilg Glad puts on the second, and the third falls and lands in front of Galadriel's feet. She takes it up and puts it on. Yes, it is accurate to the lore that the three who were given the elven rings were Gilg Glad, Galadriel, and Círdan, but this isn't how it happened. The show makes the wielders of the ring seem almost haphazard, pure chance, which doesn't agree with the lore, and it doesn't make sense with the logic of the show either. The stated reason in the show to have three rings was to bring balance. If that was the goal, then the elves who bear the rings should be carefully determined by those who most likely embody and sustain that balance, not the first three schmucks who happen to put one on their fingers. But this is what Rings of Power does. Everything is haphazard. Characters like Galadriel, Gilg Glad, and Círdan trample what good sense they should have so plot can happen. There are a couple other storylines here. We see a bit of Nori and the Stranger. Their journey isn't going well. They've gotten themselves lost and have been walking in circles, until Poppy somehow catches up with them, carrying a map that she was either given or stole, showing exactly how to get where they're going. We also learn that the Stranger hasn't gotten any better at wielding his magic, and he's having dreams about a staff sticking out of the ground out in the middle of nowhere. We also get to see them eating bugs, because that's the thing we needed in Lord of the Rings. Lastly, we have Sauron, who after menacingly looking over the land of Mordor in all his evil Dark Lord persona, decided to pretend to be a refugee, let himself be caught by the Orcs so he could talk to Adar. Halbrand Sauron promises secret knowledge about Sauron if Adar will let his people go.
Let my people go.
Leaving aside the weird biblical reference here,
Let my people go.
Let my people go.
I have to admit I don't understand Sauron's plan. He gets himself caught and beaten up, all so he can make an alliance with Adar, with the promise of delivering something Adar hasn't been interested in, and has no reason to believe Halbrand Sauron can deliver. But again, plot needs to happen, so Adar agrees. He lets a bunch of his captives go, and Halbrand Sauron returns to Celebrimbor, who hasn't gotten Gilg Glad's message. There's no reason the message shouldn't have reached the Elven Smith by that point, and we're not told why, except that it's obvious that the messengers were intercepted somehow. So in another instance that shouldn't be possible, Halbrand Sauron enters Eregion. and that is the first episode of Rings of Power Season 2. It has all the worst parts of the first season distilled into a 1-hour serving. The pace is slow, padded with scenes that don't offer much, and filled with characters doing things against their natures. Things happen because they have to happen for other things to happen, not because they make any sense. If this is the tone they're starting with, it doesn't bode well for the rest of the season, and we'll see that in episode 2. The second episode starts with Galadriel having a vision which leads her to believe that Sauron will return to Celebrimbor and make more rings. Again, the characters seem to understand the threat, and at the same time disregard it. Galadriel wants to go to Eregion and check on Celebrimbor, but the king doesn't want to send her. He says once Sauron has gained someone's trust, he can deceive them again. Of course, Gilg Glad forgets that Halbrand Sauron also gained Celebrimbor's trust, so he is very much in danger. But Galadriel has a plan. She hopes if she takes Elrond with her, it will be enough to satisfy Gilg Glad. But Elrond, who has quickly become one of my favorite characters, stands up to Galadriel, again confronting her for her part in what has happened. Galadriel teeters, trying to deny her responsibility but also admitting that she was deceived once. She seems to understand that she is compromised but refuses to fully admit it, which does nothing to redeem her. In a moment of doubt, Elrond seeks out Círdan again, and as I mentioned before, this is not the Círdan of Tolkien lore. Instead of being a wise, clairvoyant leader, he is a foolish elitist who seems to think the elves can take what evil created and use it for good. But this conversation influences Elrond, so he goes to see Gilg Glad, and Gilg Glad appoints Elrond as the commander of an expedition to Eregion, because they've had no response from Celebrimbor and they're getting worried. And as we knew, Gilg Glad's messengers were intercepted and killed, though we don't know by whom yet. The interesting thing here is that Elrond now actually has authority over Galadriel. For now. We'll see how long that lasts. The Harfoots and the Stranger find out they're being tracked by a group of bad guys, and they decide to leave the rocky mountain path they've been on in favor of a desert shortcut. Now, I'm no tracking expert, but common sense would seem to indicate that it would be far easier to follow someone's trail through sand than through rock. Sand leaves footprints where rock doesn't. It is far easier to spot someone in a wide open plain than in a hilly rocky area filled with places to hide. But I guess that's just me, because the writers, and by extension the characters, seem to think that the desert path will somehow be safer. Which of course it isn't. These guys who have been tracking them work for the same evil people that employed the female ring race in last season. They eventually catch up with the Harfoots and the Stranger, but the Stranger randomly finds a staff appearing between cuts and uses it to summon a tornado, which blows the bad guys away, but also blows Dori and Poppy away. Oops. In Eregion, though they let Halbrand Sauron through the gate, they tell him that he's not welcome, that he should leave. Though if they didn't want him there, you wonder why they let him in the first place. Anyway, Celebrimbor says he won't deal with Halbrand again because he promised Galadriel he wouldn't. But Halbrand Sauron waits him out, until against his promise and his better judgment, he goes to talk with Halbrand Sauron anyway. And of course, Sauron manages to trick Celebrimbor into working with him again. He does this by telling the Smith that he's actually one of the Valar, celestial beings that some on Middle-earth revere for their godlike powers. Sauron quickly deceives Celebrimbor by walking through the flames of the forge, changing his appearance, and he now looks like Halbrand but with a blonde wig and elf ears. Anyway, the two get ready to start work on more rings. Lastly, we catch up with the dwarves. An earthquake caused by black tendrils spreading out from Mount Doom causes the light shafts to collapse at Kazad Doom, casting it into darkness, which will make it hard for the dwarves to grow food. Worse still, Disa and the other female dwarves who like to sing to the rock can't do their singing thing anymore. The mountain isn't talking to them, and they don't know where to dig to fix the light problem. And Disa thinks she knows why, because after King Duren III stripped Duren IV of his position, the two haven't spoken. Duren and Disa live in the slums, trying to make a living however they can. Disa thinks this separation is why the mountain won't sing back to the dwarves anymore, and she talks to both the king and her husband, trying to get them to put aside their foolish pride and reconcile. This episode ends with a summons from Celebrimbor, calling the dwarves to Eregion. Why it's sent to Duren IV, who isn't in a position of leadership anymore, I don't know, but it's clearly things are kicking into high gear here, indicating this season won't spend 2/3 of its episodes dithering about before getting to actual plot. And that is episode 2. The problems continue to multiply as we suspected. The supposed good guys are almost all arrogant, selfish, and deluded into thinking they are far more capable than they are. Without much reason given, they trample over sound arguments in pursuit of something we as an audience know will lead to their destruction. In Lord of the Rings, this prideful self-indulgence is displayed by characters like Saruman and Denethor, but they are unequivocally antagonists. They are in the wrong. To have those we are supposed to side with, to root for, display this same kind of moral foolishness does not work very well. The only exception so far has been Elrond, who has stood firm on his principles and has called out the threat. I fear this won't last, and Elrond will be compromised at some point, but for now he's just about the only good thing this season has going for it. Episode 3 opens by repeating a scene from Season 1. There's no real context given for this, and I didn't even realize it was the case until I went back and watched part of Season 1. But this scene is from Episode 7, as the Númenóreans are preparing to break camp and leave for home. Elendil is trying to calm a horse so it can be led to the ship. Elendil is the captain of the Númenórean army and the father of Isildur. the kid who in the first season is presumed dead after a flaming house came down on top of him, though his father nor anyone else went back to check or retrieve the body. Anyway, the horse, whose name is Baric, is Isildur's horse, and apparently Baric doesn't want to leave without his master. Again, it's important to note that the episode does little to re-establish all this, outside of a brief recap at the beginning. We are just kind of thrown back into the moment, and we have to remember and figure out who this horse is and why Elendil is so distraught. Elendil is told that Baric won't listen to anyone but Isildur, so Elendil lets the horse go. And here's where this episode actually picks up where the original scene ended, and follows Baric the horse. We have no idea how long he's been wandering around, but ends up walking into a group of orcs. The orcs move in to kill the horse, but Baric is a Númenórean warhorse, who is more capable than some Númenórean soldiers, and Baric kills 2 orcs with relatively little effort. He kicks one and impales it on a pointy tree branch. Another manages to get a rope around Baric's neck, but the horse runs off and drags the orc into a tree stump. And after this, I have to take a moment to reflect. They want us to believe that the orcs are a legitimate threat, strong and intimidating, a force to be reckoned with, worth fearing, and yet 2 of them were just killed by a horse. This is a problem, but I also think it's a problem that Baric was smart enough to survive on his own, capable of tracking Isildur across dozens of miles, yet not smart enough to avoid a band of orcs. But regardless, Baric runs off, and the remaining orcs don't chase him, because they say he is entering the Black Forest, and nothing ever comes out of there alive. This is not explained, nor how a random orc knows this. It's just left as an ominous tease.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Continuing to follow Baric, he enters a cave, and at last he finds Isildur, who of course is not dead, though no one thought he was. Because as we know, eventually his father Elendil becomes king, and Isildur with his father lead the armies of Middle-earth in the War of Last Alliance against Sauron. It's Isildur who cuts the Ring of Power from Sauron's hand, and he's the ancestor of Aragorn, so there's no way he could possibly have died. And leaving his fate as a kind of cliffhanger at the end of last season was a stupid misdirect. So he is alive, and somehow he got out from under that burning building that collapsed on top of him, wandered through the Black Forest and into a cave. How he did all this is a mystery they don't bother answering, because how he got there isn't as important as why he's there, and why he's there is so that Rings of Power can do some more key jingling. Isildur is wrapped up in spider webs. While trying to free himself, he is spooked by the body of an orc who's also wrapped up. Then it turns out the orc is alive, and the 2 fight until a giant spider emerges and kills the orc. Isildur manages to fight off the spider and escape on Baric. Apparently, this spider is supposed to be a reference to Shelob, but it doesn't connect very well. The spider has none of the unique characteristics or traits of the one in the Jackson film had. It comes off more as a bland, ubiquitous copycat of any number of other fantasy shows or movies. It also falls flat because, as we just said, Isildur isn't in any real danger, because he can't die. Then we jump to Númenor after the army has returned home to find the king dead. Again, we don't know where in the timeline we are. Are we still catching up to where we were in the first 2 episodes, or is this now current? I'm not going to cover this beat for beat, because there's no point. The whole part of this episode is a bunch of political intrigue and forced melodrama surrounding who will succeed the king. Most seem to assume it will be Queen Regent Muriel, but a lot of people hate her for helping Galadriel and going off with the army. Isildur's sister is mad because she thinks her brother is dead, and also, you may or may not remember, she was with the king near his death, and discovered the Palantir, and all this together has made her dislike Muriel, so the sister starts scheming with Farzon, a politician who was working behind the scenes in the first season. Anyway, a lot of this just doesn't land. They've done nothing to ease us back into this world, to reacquaint us with the people, who they are, what they want, what their motivations are. I had to look up Farzon's name because I honestly didn't remember it. The writers and showrunners have not given us what we need to be invested, so instead of intrigued, I just felt lost, wondering why I should care. Also, Muriel seems like a different character. In the first season, she's portrayed as a tough leader with a hard edge. She quickly became combative and defiant in the face of those who would challenge her. In season 2, she is uncertain, slow, and quick to call for calm. A woman slaps her in the face, and Muriel stops her guards from responding, and hugs the woman instead to show her empathy and understanding. They've done nothing to show how Muriel's experiences in Middle-earth, the loss of her men and her sight have affected her, which makes the shift feel more like an inconsistency, not character progression. Back in Middle-earth, in Mordor, Adar is mustering his forces and getting ready to march out to battle. But one orc, Glug, questions Adar for the need for more war. Glug says that orcs have won a home, a place where they're safe. Adar brushes off his concerns and walks away, and Glug walks over to a female orc holding a cooing bundle of cloth, which is supposed to be a baby. And here we have to stop for a moment. I knew this scene was coming because as soon as episode 3 released, it went viral on the internet. But knowing it was going to happen and watching it in context were 2 different things. It comes out of nowhere because all the orcs we've seen before are all violent, murderous thugs. I don't know what the predicate for this moment is, but the intent is clear. Rings of Power has already rewritten parts of the lore, the history, and changed characters so they are unrecognizable from their counterparts in the books and movies. Now, they want to rewrite the orcs as well. In Tolkien, the Orcs are a corrupt, evil race, but I'll let Christopher Lee explain it as only he can.
Do you know how the Orcs first came into being? They were elves once. Taken by the dark powers, tortured and mutilated. A ruined and terrible form of life.
Once elves, the Orcs were twisted into an evil, subservient race. They don't have much of a will of their own. They exist to mindlessly follow and serve the dark powers. They have little agency of their own. They are meant to represent the all-consuming corruption of evil, how it twists nature and can take away your very will. But the writers of Rings of Power don't want to portray the Orcs this way. These writers want the Orcs to be just another race equal to any other natural-born race. The Orcs' sin is choosing to follow Morgoth. This is why they slipped the reference into Sauron's speech during the flashback of Episode 1, where he mentions the Orcs have no choice but to follow him.
You have nowhere else to turn. The Valar will never forgive you. Elves will never accept you.
The only reason they would need forgiveness is if they chose to follow evil, just as some of the Southerners did. They need to set it up this way so they can try to influence you to care about them, to see them as victims as much as perpetrators. And that's why this scene exists. They want you to think that Orcs are just like you, with families and babies that they care about. They just want freedom.
What do you want?
Freedom.
Arguably, that makes things worse, though, as they chose to serve evil, and their version of freedom is to take whatever they want and murder anyone in their path, which hardly makes them sympathetic. Next, Duren and Disa are at a Region, with Celebrimbor and Sauron, who is posing as Annatar, but looks like Halbrand in a wig. Celebrimbor and Annatar Halbrand Sauron pitches their idea for making rings for the dwarves. Rings that will heal the mountain and restore the dwarves to power. Why are they making this offer to Duren when he no longer holds a position of authority? Because they don't think the king will listen to them, and they hope Duren will, and that the king will listen to his son and take their offer. Of course, the first season would disprove this, since King Duren wouldn't listen to anyone, not even Prince Duren, and the tension between them was played up repeatedly, so there's no reason for us to think that this would work. But for some reason, Disa does. It's because for Duren to speak to his father again, the two would have to reconcile, which we know is a goal of Disa's. So the thing with the rings is just a vehicle to get father and son back together, which is the convenient way to hand-wave away all the suspicious things around Celebrimbor and his offer. But Duren is stubborn and doesn't want to talk to his dad, which leads to a fight with him and Disa, until she threatens Duren that if he doesn't take the offer to the king, she will. After this, Celebrimbor talks to Annatar Halbrand Sauron, who warns him that they shouldn't tell Gilg Glad about making more rings, because the Elvish king wouldn't want other races to have them. Celebrimbor falls for this, and writes a letter to Gilg Glad, lying that he's shutting down the forge, hoping it will buy enough time for him to carry out their plan. This reinforces just how bad a character this version of Celebrimbor is, driven by arrogance and pride. Everything he does makes him look like a foolish idiot. Back with Isildur, he makes his way along until he comes across a girl. We don't know who she is, but Isildur picks her up and the two are attacked by some wildmen. Baric lets himself be stolen, and things look grim, and then Arondir shows up. He jumps and he spins and he shoots some arrows at the bad guys. Isildur recognizes Arondir from the battle at the end of last season, but Arondir is not friendly. He is moody and terse, but he allows Isildur and his new girlfriend to follow him. Back in Moria, people are already going hungry, because they can't grow food without the light shafts, but we are still hampered by not knowing how much time is passing. The light shafts just collapsed in the last episode, and it doesn't seem like more than a few days have passed, but already the dwarves are running out of food. But this is done to make the situation more dire and desperate, so that when Duren finally does go to speak to his father, we know what's going to happen. Isildur and the girl follow Arondir back to where the refugees of the Southlands have been staying, and we find out why Arondir is in a bad mood. Bronwyn, the female village leader and Arondir's love interest, has died. How, you ask? She seemed pretty alive last time we saw her at the end of episode 7 last season. Well, remember Bronwyn was hit by an arrow, and apparently the arrow had a poison, a special orc poison that didn't affect her for days while she recovered, and then suddenly the poison did affect her and she died. The truth is, the actress left after season 1, and as I have mentioned, Bronwyn and the Romeo-Juliet romance between her and Arondir was pointless. There was no point for the character or the subplots connected to her. We know this because the actor who played Adar also left, but they recast him because he is integral to the plot. Bronwyn died off-screen in between seasons because she wasn't. Bronwyn might be gone, but her death does give us the opportunity to have more forced melodrama. Unfortunately, they haven't taken the time to rebuild any investment in these characters, and they haven't earned the pathos they're desperately trying to invoke. It also hurts the character of Arondir, making him seem rather useless. Yes, he can jump and flip and shoot arrows while trying to look cool, but consider his journey. He got himself captured by orcs. He couldn't do much to save his fellow elves. He couldn't save the villagers. He couldn't save Bronwyn. And he couldn't connect to Theo, Bronwyn's son. Arondir tries to have a heart-to-heart with the kid, but Theo tells Arondir that he only put up with him because of his mom, Now that she's gone, he doesn't ever want to see or speak to him again. Yep, Arendir's a bit of a joke. Though I do think it's funny that Theo has obviously aged a couple of years in what canonically should only be a few days. Anyway, Theo does talk to Isildur and tells him that he can help Isildur find his horse. Isildur goes and talks with the girl he rescued, Estrid, and has a strange heart-to-heart with her, where he says that his mom's death was his fault. And then he cries, but it's time for him to go off with Theo. And after they've left, we learn something about Estrid. She has Adar's brand on her back, but she takes a knife that she's been heating up in the campfire and tries to burn it off. Theo leads Isildur to where the wild men who attacked them earlier are camped. Isildur goes to get Baric, but makes a noise, catching attention. But Theo pops up and tries to distract these guys, showing them the mark he got from the evil sword hilt, to prove he's one of them. But it's not the same as the mark of Adar. And then something attacks the camp. Isildur runs away and we're left not knowing what happened. Except that we do, because thanks to the trailers we know we're about to meet the Ents. But that will have to wait, because we go back to Numenor. Muriel walks into the Grand Hall for her coronation, but dissenting voices speak out. Unrest rises, which crescendos when the sister appears and tells everyone that Muriel is a fake queen, because she has been guided by the Palantir, which Numenorians regard as an elvish artifact, meaning in effect that Muriel is actually being controlled by the elves. Sister pulls out the Palantir, which she stole from the secret room, and throws it to the ground. Muriel tries to deny the accusation, but when Farzon suggests that they destroy the Palantir, Muriel reflectively calls out to stop them, which seems to confirm everything. And if this wasn't bad enough, the scene gets worse. In the midst of all the unrest, an eagle flies up to the Grand Hall. Farzon approaches the eagle and it screeches, which all the people seem to take as an omen that the eagle has chosen him to be the king, and everyone instantly starts to chant his name. Now earlier there was talk about how eagles occasionally show up at coronations to bless new rulers, but this doesn't make much sense. It's pulled from an obscure piece of lore where eagles lived on the mountains in the north part of the island. The Numenorians consider the mountains sacred, and the eagle is tied to their god Eru. So the writers took this and tried to use the eagles as little more than a good omen. But they didn't set it up very well, and in Season 1, Numenor is very much tied to the sea, not flying creatures from the sky.
The sea is always right!
The sea is always right!
Anyway, that's Episode 3. A lot of boring scenes drawn out too long, with forced melodrama featuring characters you may or may not remember. They've done nothing to rebuild our investment in this world or earn the payoffs they're trying to get. And it doesn't get much better in Episode 4. Amidst the bloat of Episode 4, we have two consequential conversations. One between Elrond and Galadriel that tells us a lot about her character. The other between the stranger and a new character, which is one of the worst written dialogue so far. But at the same time, it is potentially one of the most important in terms of what the writers are trying to set up. Episode 4 begins on Elrond and Galadriel as they get ready to set out for Eregion. They say there's been no word yet from Celebrimbor, which means the letter that he wrote to King Gilg Glad hasn't arrived yet. Maybe the mystery messenger slayer has struck again. Maybe this show just depends on characters not communicating for its plot to happen. Take your pick. Galadriel continues to be snippy and insufferable towards Elrond. She's been demoted by Gilg Glad, and she's very passive-aggressive about it. Though it is interesting that the king chose these two to lead the expedition, when Galadriel lied to him and Elrond openly defied him. But Gilg Glad has apparently let all that slide because he's read the script and knows that these two have to be a part of the team. Then we jump partway through their journey, where we meet the rest of the group that Elrond assembled for the mission, and Amazon proves yet again that while they don't understand Tolkien very well, they do understand tokenizing. Our band has been stopped short because a very important stone bridge has been destroyed. Galadriel thinks Sauron did it, but Galadriel is blaming Sauron for everything at this point, and without evidence or some kind of logic, her accusations come off more as obsessive and paranoid, not insightful. But the writers want the ring she wears to be the logic. They want the ring to be the motivating factor behind Galadriel's actions. She's not being irrational because the ring is giving her insight, which is lazy and doesn't let Galadriel grow as a character, because anything potentially positive she does now doesn't come from herself, but from a piece of jewelry. They've also removed her loci of control, and with it, any sense of integrity, especially because they're also trying to maintain attention over whether the rings are corrupted or not, which is a lazy way to mystery box stakes and string us along. This is also another prequel problem, because we know that Sauron becomes the Dark Lord, rises to power, and nearly conquers all of Middle-earth. That means in Rings of Power, either the Elvish rings are corrupt and our heroes are compromised fools, or the rings are not corrupt and useless because they do nothing to help the elves stop Sauron. Anyway, with the bridge out, there are two alternative routes, a fast one and a slow one. Galadriel's ring gives her a vision of danger awaiting on the fast path, but Elrond doesn't trust the ring and maintains that both paths could hold danger. He then orders them to take the short route because they don't have time to take the long way around. We see the stranger wandering around looking for Nori and Poppy. He doesn't find them, but he does find a strange hermit who is supposed to be Tom Bombadil. But as with other characters that they've inappropriately roped into this show, they don't get him right either. So I'm going to call him Not Tom. Not Tom talks in riddles and doesn't really answer any of the stranger's questions. The stranger pulls out a scrap of paper with a star constellation he's been chasing, only to have it blown out of his hands by the wind, and he chases it to a tree. And here I start to wonder if I'm watching a high fantasy show or a cartoon. Scratch that, the cartoon was a way more faithful adaptation of Lord of the Rings than this crappy show. The stranger notices that a branch of the tree looks a lot like the staff he's been dreaming about. When he tries to break the branch off, the tree eats him. Now this is another example of a repurposed scene from the book Fellowship of the Ring, where the hobbits have a similar problem and are rescued by Tom Bombadil. But before the stranger can be rescued, we jump to Nori and Poppy, who are just fine after being flung into the air by a tornado. They start to look for the stranger, but then they run into a halfling-looking guy, and the Harfoots suddenly decide to forget about the stranger and decide to follow him back to his village. We also learn that the halfling guy and his people are Stoors, another hobbit-like race. But that's not important. Nori says they're looking for their friend, who is a wizard, but the store's leader says they only know of one wizard, the Dark Wizard, so they think that Nori and Poppy are working for the bad guys, because again, this entire show is built on bad communication. Meanwhile, the masked hunter has abandoned his search again to report back to the Dark Wizard guy. Dark Wiz tells the masked hunter to look for the Harfoots, and that he plans to go after the stranger personally. Not Tom pulls the stranger out of the tree and takes him home for a long, drawn-out talk. Not Tom offers the stranger some food and walks around showing off his ability to use magic. This leads to an important conversation between the two. The stranger is desperate to learn how to use his magic, to gain a hold on his purpose. Not Tom continues to be evasive and rarely gives a straight answer. But when the stranger asks Not Tom if he can give him a staff, Not Tom calls back to a previous line and said that staffs are like names. No one can give one to you. It's yours once you've earned it. And since the tree ate the stranger instead of giving him one of its branches, he clearly hasn't earned it yet. But this just doesn't make any sense. Names generally are given. Characters like Gandalf and Aragorn have more than one name given to them. But Not Tom doesn't elaborate much on this, so the stranger doesn't know what he needs to do to earn his name and staff. Then they start talking about Sauron and the Dark Wizard, and Not Tom tells the stranger that it is his duty to stand against them both. So let me get this straight. No one can give you a name, and they can't give you a staff, but they can give you a life's purpose. How does that make sense? And why is this coming from a guy we just met? The writers really are inept, again, just telling characters and us plot information because they don't know how to build it organically. And they hope by having a beloved character like Tom Bombadil deliver it will somehow lend it credibility. They are parasites leeching off Tolkien's lore, using it as cred to buy investment from fans, and it doesn't work. The elves are walking through a spooky forest at night. They are attacked by ghostly apparitions called wights, but the elves' weapons don't seem to work. Luckily, Elrond knows that wights can only be slain by the weapons that they carried when they were still alive. And even more lucky, he finds that right next to them is an overturned cart carrying the weapons that can kill the wights. Lucky, except for the one guy who died before they could figure it out. He wasn't so lucky. Of course, if Galadriel was expecting some dark evil was waiting for them, she might have advised that they wait until daylight to cross the cursed forest, and not attempt it at night. But that would require she have some common sense and wisdom, which she clearly doesn't have. It also helps make my point that the supposed guidance that the rings offer don't account for very much. Isildur and Arondir, I think I've been saying that guy's name wrong this whole time, and for that I apologize. Anyway, Isildur and Arondir have organized a search party to look for Theo. They are walking along, yelling Theo's name in the same forest that we now know contains wildmen and a mysterious threat that attacked the camp just hours before. So a large group of people wandering around with torches yelling doesn't seem very smart. But they find a body of a dead person, and then they all go back to the village to discuss what to do next. Arondir figures out that Estrid tried to hide her brand by burning herself, and then Arondir, Isildur, and Estrid are walking through the forest. Just those three. Everyone else decided to stay home, I guess. Estrid is chained up because they don't trust her anymore, but they do trust her to lead them to the wildmen who they think have Theo. That is until Arondir has an elf moment and realizes something else is going on. Something that he doesn't share with the group before we cut to Theo and some of the wildmen, waking up in a tree that is also a cage. Then Isildur and his company are trudging through a swamp. Isildur gets himself stuck in some quicksand and starts sinking. Arondir tries to pull him out only to get sucked in and they both disappear. And they're still teasing that Isildur can be in any kind of danger, which he's not. It turns out the quicksand isn't quicksand but a nasty worm thing that has eaten both the guys, and almost eats Estrid, when in another scene out of a cartoon, Arondir cuts his way out of the swamp snake from the inside. Both he and Isildur pop out and the snake slithers back into the swamp. Yes, this is a thing that really happens in this episode. And yes, it makes even less sense than the barrel scene from The Hobbit. Back with Nori and Poppy, the Stoors say that they're going to throw them out of the village in the morning, because it's still night there, or night again. Not really sure because the show's timeline is getting wonky again. But Nori brings up Sadak, the Harfoot leader who died at the end of the first season, and the name means something to the Stoors' leader. She takes Nori aside to tell her that someone named Sadak once left the Stoors with a group of people, looking for some kind of promised land. So apparently they're all related. But this doesn't have time to sink in because the tracker dude shows up, and he wants the Harfoots, and we get this moment.
Do you know why we wear these masks? No one cared who I was till I put on the mask.
And then the scene just ends abruptly, so we can get back to the elves. They've buried their friend, and now Galadriel and Elrond have another chat. And this is another conversation we need to take a minute to talk about. Galadriel says she believes her ring is guiding her, not deceiving her. Though it just led them into an ambush of wights that got one of them killed. But Galadriel is convinced that following the ring's guidance will lead them to victory. Elrond questions the price of that victory, and Galadriel basically says that she doesn't care, that she's willing to pay any price to defeat Sauron. This is played as if she's talking about herself, that she is willing to sacrifice herself to stop Sauron. But there's a couple big problems here. So far, the price for her actions has primarily been borne by others. The elves, the people of the Southlands, the Númenóreans, all of them have sustained heavy losses following Galadriel. Worse yet, all of her actions have done nothing to stop Sauron. Her single-minded arrogance has instead enabled and empowered him. She is the only reason that Sauron is in Eregion, working with Celebrimbor. But since the show wants us to still like Galadriel, to see her as the hero, they instead need us to agree with her that Sauron poses such a threat that they must stop him no matter what. Though I also have to say the argument that the ends justify the means usually does not come from a hero, and more often is used by villains. Even so, this scene ends when one of the elves comes up and says they've heard the sound of orc drums. Back with Isildur's group, where it's night again for some reason, Isildur decides to unlock Estred's restraints, and she immediately betrays him. Then, after drawing it out for the whole episode, the Ents show up. 2 Ents to be specific, and because it's the Second Age, we get to DEI in a female Ent, because by the Second Age the Entwise had not disappeared yet. Anyway, the Ents are very mad because someone has been cutting down trees. Arondir isn't useless for once and is able to use his elfiness to calm things down. The Ents decide that they aren't the ones responsible and let them go, along with Theo and the Wildmen they had captured earlier. And apparently Estred knows one of the Wildmen. So happy reunions, more melodrama, more callbacks to Tolkien lore used as little more than plot filler and Easter eggs. But at the end of the scene, Arondir does learn that the ones who have been cutting down trees are orcs. And you know what that means. A bunch of forced BS is being laid out so that all of our characters will wind up in the same place again. Finally, we're back with the elves again, watching the orcs from a perch on a hill. They assume the orcs must be marching for Eregion, because where else on Middle-earth could they be headed? Only just before they're discovered. The orcs start to shoot arrows toward the elves, and one gets hit. But that's okay, because Galadriel's ring now has the ability to heal mortal wounds too. Gee, I wonder where they got that idea. I could debate whether this has any basis in the lore, but I'm not going to bother. This show has so corrupted the lore as to make it useless. But there's no setup for it within the episode itself, which makes it lazy and stupid. But with Elf Dude healed, Galadriel tells Elrond to take her ring and to return to Lindon, to warn the king to send the army to Eregion instead of Mordor. Then Galadriel runs off to hold off the orc army. One of the elves thinks Galadriel is sacrificing herself so they can get away, but Elrond says she's doing it to save the ring, not them. And now we get the warrior Galadriel scene that we've been missing for the past 3 episodes. She runs up, takes out a bunch of orcs, steals a horse, and starts to ride away, only to ride back so she can taunt them, and she gets herself caught. The episode ends with her coming face to face with Adar again, only this time, she's the prisoner. Whoa, what a switch. And that is episode 4. The meaningful story elements take up about 15 minutes of its hour-plus runtime. There is a lot of padding and stringing out of plot beats. The stranger starts to look for the Harfoots only to stop and go somewhere else. The Harfoots start looking for the stranger only to stop and go somewhere else. The villagers start to look for Theo only to stop and go home. The trackers stop tracking to go report to the Dark Wizard. This back and forth is not a necessity. It is a way to multiply scenes and pad out runtimes. The show tells rather than shows important story points and character beats. The source material is bastardized and used as Easter eggs to add a veneer of legitimacy. But the truth is, this is garbage tier fantasy writing set within the god tier fantasy world Tolkien created. And as good as Tolkien's writings are, it cannot carry what Rings of Power is trying to do with it. With episode 5, Halls of Stone, we cross the halfway mark of season 2. And here, the pace starts to pick up a little, at least when it comes to the plotlines in Kazad Doom and Númenor. Unfortunately, the story is put together like a bridge from Portal Bridge Constructor, so when the show actually tries to run on it, yeah, it falls apart. There's a fair amount of writing in this episode that contradicts itself in the same scene. The timeline is still mutilated beyond comprehension, and we still have a continued and growing problem with the characters, but I will talk about that more at the end of the video. For now, let's get into it. We open on a sweeping shot of the Misty Mountains, which takes us into Kazad Doom. The 7 rings for the dwarves have been completed. No idea how long it took, or why they gave them all to King Duren. Obviously, Rings of Power isn't concerned with details like that. King Duren selects one of the rings and puts it on, and we hear whispers of black speech, similar to a scene from the Lord of the Rings movies. This is to tell us that unlike the Elven rings, the Dwarven rings are definitely corrupted by Sauron. They don't want us to have any questions about it this time. King Duren goes to inspect where the miners are digging new light shafts. The king walks along one of the rock walls until we hear more black speech, and his ringed finger is drawn to a specific spot. The king tells the miners to dig at that spot, but Prince Duren objects. He tries to tell his father that the wall he's chosen is load-bearing, but the king yells back that he knows the mountain better, and then orders them again to dig. But they remain hesitant, so the king picks up a pickaxe and starts swinging at the wall himself. A short time jump later, King Duren is still picking away at the wall. His son asks him to take a rest, but the king persists. Then the whole cavern starts to shudder and shake, but the king's pickaxe breaks through the rock and sunlight spills into the darkened space. Prince Duren looks rather shocked. Apparently he was wrong about the wall being load-bearing. I don't know why they included this bit. It makes Prince Duren look incompetent and adds unnecessary tension. Are we supposed to believe the ring doesn't work the way the plot would demand it does? I don't know. But the king directs more workers to more spots, and more light shafts are found. So just like that, the dwarves have restored light to Kazad Doom. The king is speaking to his people and says he pities those who dwell above, for they are slaves to the sun.
Pity those who dwell above, slaves to the sun.
In Kazad Doom, we are free of its tyranny.
We bring the sun to us.
What? The entire kingdom was just in a dire situation because they had lost access to the sun. They are obviously very dependent on it to grow food. And as impressive as their system of mirrors is, I'm pretty sure the sun still sets on the Misty Mountains, which means they still experience a form of night. I suspect this is to illustrate how the dwarves see themselves as separate and different. It just doesn't work in this context. But setting that aside, they have the sunlight back, and they have food, because the shortages that were threatening the kingdom aren't mentioned again. They must have some kind of magical, fast-growing crops or something. The king praises his new Ring of Power for the success, and we see that Disa is not happy about this. It's clear that she's afraid that the Stone Singers have lost their positions, that they've been replaced by the ring. But then we jump back to Aragon, where an envoy of the dwarves have returned to celebrate the success of the rings. Just keep in mind the distance between Kazad Doom and Aragon. For dwarves, this would easily be a week's worth of walking, at least. And that isn't possible, when placed next to the show's other storylines that we are supposed to believe are concurrent with this. Anyway, Celebrimbor touts the continued alliance between elves and dwarves by unveiling the Doors of Duren, the magic mithril doors that you might remember guarding the entrance to Moria in Fellowship of the Ring. Yep, more awkward callbacks and Easter eggs. And once again, Anatar Hellbrand Sauron is just lurking in the background. He doesn't seem happy about Celebrimbor's showmanship, but I'm not sure if he's actually disapproving or just constipated. Anatar Hellbrand Sauron leaves the party to go off on his own, and is followed by Celebrimbor, who questions him about not enjoying the celebration. Anatar Hellbrand Sauron explains that he's having trouble remaining festive, while people are still suffering under the result of Mordor's rise. And in a rare moment of competent insight, Celebrimbor picks up that he is backhandedly trying to bring up the idea of making rings for men. Anatar Hellbrand Sauron starts to deny this, but Celebrimbor says he's caught on to his game, how he plants ideas in people's minds and makes them think the ideas are their own, though I don't really think we've seen him do this. So far, Anatar Hellbrand Sauron has spent a lot of time silently sulking, and his primary method of manipulation has been to act really passive-aggressive, which does the character of Sauron a massive disservice. And if he keeps this up, I'm going to resort to calling him Low T Sauron.
Low testosterone, or low T.
So Celebrimbor, who's not acting like an idiot for once, stands his ground and says he won't make rings for men. Anatar Hellbrand Sauron replies by saying that he will make the rings himself. Then Celebrimbor goes back to being an idiot and just stands there and watches, as Anatar Hellbrand Sauron walks away to fire up the forge. I'm sorry, Lord Celebrimbor is the master of the forge. All the elves who work there work for him. They respect him, follow him, and learn from him. So if Celebrimbor truly was against making rings for men, he could easily order his people not to work on them, or even shut down the forge as a way to dissuade it. But no, he just stands there and pouts while Anatar Hellbrand Sauron takes over. Back in Numenor, Farzon is king now. Not sure how or when that happened. His coronation seems like an important story development to happen off-screen. But again, the Rings of Power has its own priorities. Farzon asks his son if he's ever seen the tower that stands on the island of Tol Eressëa. This island lies just off the shores of Valinor, and is close enough to Numenor that it can be seen from one of its tallest peaks. It is a strange bit of lore to drop here, especially since the last time we saw some elves at the entrance of Valinor, they didn't show us any signs of Tol Eressëa. Not to mention, in the first season, Galadriel jumped from a boat that was about to enter Valinor. She swam, drifted on a raft with Sauron, and then sailed on a Numenorian ship over what we were led to believe was days. So how can this be? Well, obviously Rings of Power follows its own lore about as well as it follows Tolkien's. This conversation is a massive information dump, where they finally tell us who Farazan is, and what his ambitions are. And as with other characters, they have him just tell us rather than build it through context clues. Farazan has a Lucifer complex. He thinks that Numenor can ascend beyond the elves and attain power and immortality for themselves. This scene is primarily here to set up the events that will lead to Numenor's downfall in a later season, but it also ham-fistedly gives us the son's motivation that he needs to do what he does later in this episode. Farzon says that his wife made a prophecy that their son would come to a bad end, and he hopes his son will prove it wrong. Wait, Numenorians prophesy now? Since when is that a thing? We cut over to Elendil and Muriel. Elendil is already talking about overthrowing Farzon to put Muriel back on the throne. He says she still has many supporters, though that didn't stop Farzon from taking over. But Muriel isn't interested in staging a revolt. She asks Elendil what he saw when he touched the Palantir at the coronation. Elendil says he saw a vision of riding on a horse toward a city he did not recognize. He doesn't explain this further. There's no discussion about what it could mean. Nope, they don't address it at all, because instead Muriel jumps in to tell him that the Palantir has only ever showed one vision: the destruction of Numenor. Muriel seems to believe that because Elendil didn't see the same vision, that the future has changed. That Farzon becoming ruler instead of her has changed Numenor's fate. No, that doesn't make sense. But regardless, Muriel doesn't want to be ruler anymore. She tells Elendil to return to his ship to continue serving Numenor. Elendil submits and returns, only to find that his crew has all been relieved of duty, and finds that he himself has been stripped of his command. Elendil demands to know who ordered this when his daughter pops up to say she did. Apparently, she's been given a job high up in Farzon's new administration, and she's firing anyone she doesn't believe is loyal to the new king. This character continues to be one of the worst, running a close second to Galadriel for me. She has no real motivation for what she's doing. Why is she so loyal to Farzon that she's betraying her own father? Don't know. Elendil is understandably upset over this. Sister tries to reason with him. She tells him that everything will be fine if he just swears fealty to the new king. She frames this as if she's helping him, to see the right thing to do, which makes her out to be a snake if she thinks she can stab someone in the back and still pretend to be on their side. Of course, Elendil is portrayed as a man of honor and integrity. He refuses to bend the knee, and urges his men to accept that he is no longer their captain. And then Rings of Power rips off a scene from Dead Poets Society, and we have a Captain My Captain scene.
Captain, my captain?
I shouldn't have to say this, but copying and pasting a scene from a great film doesn't improve your crappy one. Just before we leave Numenor, we see that Farzon has the Palantir, and of course we know he's going to use it. But we're back in Lindon, where Gilg Glad is reading Celebrimbor's letter, the letter he wrote in episode 3. It's only just now reached Gilg Glad. Okay, hold on. When Gilg Glad sent a letter to Celebrimbor in episode 1, by episode 2 they were worried that they hadn't heard back from him yet. Then in episode 3, Celebrimbor writes a letter to Gilg Glad, and it doesn't arrive until episode 5.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
Since he sent that letter, the dwarves had made 3 trips from Kazad Doom to Eregion and back. They have forged the 7 dwarven rings, and Elrond's team made it most of the way from Lindon to Eregion. Oh well. Overlaid with Gilg Glad reading the letter, we see Annatar Helbrand Sauron is working with the Forge Elves to create the rings for men, while Celebrimbor continues to just watch them. A female elf commander urges Gilg Glad to send the army to attack Mordor before Adar can gather more strength, though it's odd they don't know Adar has left Mordor with his army. Apparently they don't have a single scout reporting what's actually happening in Mordor. But Gilg Glad isn't really listening to his female elf commander, because as he fondles his ring, he gets another vision. Fish flopping around on the ground, death and destruction. The female elf commander is why Gilg Glad is letting random visions from his ring sway his decision making, which is a good question, but I'm not sure why it's coming from this character. The elves all saw the power of the rings, the way it restored the tree and healed the elves. Why would they be doubting it now? We don't get an answer for that, because we cut away to the dwarves. Prince Duren and Disa are at home, talking about the king's obsession with his new ring, and as predicted, Disa now doesn't trust it. Her stone singing has been usurped, and she isn't happy about it. Another jump brings Duren and Disa to the shopping market. Disa spots a round gemstone that she wants to buy for their daughter's birthday, but the merchant tells them all the prices have gone up because the king has ordered a new ring tax on everything. This drops out of nowhere, but immediately validates Disa in her distrust over the influence the ring is having on the king. Disa haggles the merchant down, and they buy the gemstone, but then Duren just kind of disappears, and Disa drops the gemstone. It rolls off through the crowded market and into an opening in the rock wall. Disa chases it all the way down to a hidden cavern and picks it up, but then she hears some strange noises and rumblings coming from beneath the floor. She tries to do her stone singing thing, but the noises and rumbling gets worse, and she drops the gemstone again, and it smashes on the ground. Oh no, the birthday present for the daughter that we've never met. It is fascinating that they keep referencing these kids that are so unimportant they've never even shown them. Next, King Duren has called together representatives of the 6 dwarf lords from across Middle-earth. Hard to say how long that would have taken, since they haven't told us where the other dwarf kingdoms are. But King Duren talks about the threats they all face, and how the rings are the answer to those threats, that he will share them for a price. We don't hear what that price is, or if they've accepted, because we cut to the king talking to the miners. It seems there's a massive wealth of gold under Kazad Doom. The dwarves have never touched the gold because of fears of mining too deep, but now the king doesn't care and orders they mine the gold anyway. Supposedly this is because of the ring's influence over him, but in this scene he isn't even wearing it. There's a weird moment where he freaks out and realizes it's not on his finger. He doesn't remember taking it off and he accuses someone of trying to steal it, but it's on the table right next to him, and when he puts it back on, a calm seems to descend on him. Then Prince Duren shows up to tell the king about Disa's encounter in the cavern. He says she heard a nameless ancient evil, something Disa has somehow gleaned from a strange noise and some shaking rocks. But the king doesn't listen. He says through the ring he can see the mountain. He knows it, and there's nothing to fear. In Eregion, one of the elf workers seems to have disappeared, and stuff starts moving by itself. Celebrimbor grabs and pulls the ring out of nothing, and then an elf girl rematerializes. See, they have forged the first of the 9 rings. An elf girl put it on to size it, then she turned invisible. She starts muttering about another world that she saw while wearing the ring, but Anatar Halbrand Sauron calms her down. Celebrimbor wants to know how they made the new ring. Elfgirl says they added more mithril to it to fortify it against corruption. Though we don't know how any of this works, so it's just meaningless jargon thrown around to sound like it means something. Like tech babble in sci-fi.
The core element is based on an FTL nanoprocessor with 25 bilateral kelolactrals.
Anatar Halbrand Sauron acts like he doesn't know what he's doing, and asks Celebrimbor for help. Help with what? I don't know, but it's really just an excuse to rope the Master Smith back into this again. But then Duren arrives in Eregion. He's afraid the ring is having a negative influence on his father.
Now, they tell me he refuses to share the other rings unless the Dwarf Lords promise him half a share of their mines. Now, greed is not his way. It never has been.
Celebrimbor assures him that this isn't possible, that the 7 rings were made just like the 3 elven rings, and Duren suggests that maybe the problem is the ring maker, casting some shade at Anatar Halbrand Sauron.
How much do you really know about this Anatar?
Meanwhile, while they're talking, Anatar Halbrand Sauron is counseling the young elf girl about what she saw while wearing the ring. He compares her beauty to Galadriel's, and the compliment is so strong she forgets everything and seems to be falling for him. Yes, that's a thing that really happens. Back in Numenor, Elendil is taking part in a ceremony for the soldiers who died in Middle-earth at an old elven temple. Farzon's son shows up with some soldiers to shut down the temple because they want to tear it down to build a new aqueduct. The kid provokes Elendil until he punches him, and Elendil is arrested. But this guy, I don't remember his name, I called him Curly in my notes. Curly attacks the kid, and they fight. Curly breaks his arm and has him at sword point, but Elendil tells Curly not to kill him. Curly drops the sword and starts to walk away, but the kid stabs him through the back, and Curly dies.
Show me what you got. Is that the best you can do?
I'm sorry, I know this is supposed to be sad, but we barely know Curly, and this moment is so choreographed and over the top it's hard not to laugh at it. Anyway, the point is things are looking grim in Numenor. In Eregion, Celebrimbor is talking to Anatar Halbrand Sauron about Durin's concerns about the Dwarven rings. He wonders what they did different that could have had a negative impact on the rings. Anatar Halbrand Sauron tells them that they introduced deception when they lied to the king, and that found its way into the rings. He tells Celebrimbor to go confess to Gilg Glad, to set things right before things get worse, but Celebrimbor believes that Gilg Glad would imprison him for what he's done. Before that, he wants to finish his work, though he's already been warned that things will get worse. In Kazad Doom, Duren tries to talk to his father again, but the king just wants to praise him for pushing their alliance with the elves, and he offers him his position as prince back. In Lindon, Elrond has finally reached Gilg Glad to warn him about the impending attack on Eregion, but Gilg Glad tells him that the elves can't fight 2 battles at once, at least not alone. But there's no time to explain that because the Orcs have drawn close to Eregion. They are making camp and preparing for an attack. Galadriel is wheeled into the camp in a cage. Glug lets her out only to threaten to cut her throat, but Adar steps in to stop him. Galadriel thanks Adar by grabbing him and pressing a shift to his throat, but a level-headed Adar tells Galadriel that instead of an enemy, she should regard him as an ally against their common enemy. The scene cliffhangs there as the elves in Eregion restart their work on the 9 rings for men. And that is episode 5 of Rings of Power Season 2. They jump around a lot, further scrolling up the timeline and throw in a bunch of forced exposition with little or no context. But I want to take a moment and discuss what may be Rings of Power's biggest flaw. The characters. A big issue I have with this show is how it treats its characters, or lack thereof. That is to say, Rings of Power doesn't have many characters. Now I can hear you say, but this show has a huge cast. How can you say there's no characters? That's because characters in fiction have depth. They have motivations. They have thoughts and feelings. They have past experiences which inform how they behave. Well, written characters are just like people in the real world. Their speech and actions should be understandable and perhaps even predictable as you get to know them. After a while, you learn to anticipate how they will act based on that knowledge. Rings of Power doesn't have those kinds of characters. In this show, they are little more than plot devices. They have no reason to exist beyond the purpose they serve in the narrative, the equivalent of a cog in a machine. They are necessary for the machine to run, but their worth only comes from their function. This makes it hard to set stakes for them because there is no investment. For instance, there is no weight to Curly's death because we barely know who he is. Isildur's sister is a force in reshaping Numenor, but we know nothing of her motivation. How much does she know about what happened in Middle-earth? The events that led to Isildur's supposed death? Why does she blame Muriel for a volcano exploding? Why does she trust Farzon to the extent that she's willing to betray her own father? We don't know any of this, so this sister isn't a character. She is a plot mover. She is a means to a narrative end. Rings of Power is replete with these kinds of characters. They just do things so that things can happen, so that other things can happen. None of it is motivated, and therefore it carries no weight. Especially since many of us know what happens in this story. We know where it leads, and that removes a lot of the tension. The biggest thing the Rings of Power could give us to invest in, then, is its characters. Strong, relatable characters that we like to see on screen, that we could develop a connection with. Then there would be stakes, because even though we know what happens to some of these characters, we still care enough to be invested in their journey. By refusing to build strong, well-defined characters, the showrunners have hamstrung themselves. There's no reason to care, which makes the whole affair rather insipid. Before I get into the play-by-play of episode 6, Where Is He?, I need to take a moment to discuss something. We spend a fair amount of time in Numenor, and the developments that are happening there, but the writers are barreling ahead building a major conflict without the appropriate context. So since Rings of Power refuses to give you the information you need to understand their story, I'm going to do my best to fill in the gaps. This season they've been laying a lot of groundwork to show Numenor breaking into two groups, a progressive side led by Farazon and those like him. They claim to be looking forward to Numenor's future. They are interested in parting ways with their history and traditions concerning the elves and the Valar. The other side is a conservative group known as the Faithful. They've been mentioned a couple of times in Rings of Power, but without explaining who they are. In J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, the island of Numenor was originally called Elna. It was raised out of the sea by the Valar, and given as a home to the Duodane, a mighty race of men who were known for their strength and longevity. The Duodane on Elna later renamed the island Numenor, and became the Numenorians. The Faithful are the people who remember this and remain faithful to it and the Valar, their traditions, legacy, and worship handed down to them over hundreds of years. What we have in Rings of Power is a split between these two sides. The show is accelerating a division that took place over something like 1,000 years, and is compressing it into a span of weeks and months, all of it leading to a civil war in which Farazon and his king's men will expel the Faithful to Middle-earth. This is how we get Elendil and Isildur becoming kings in Arnor and Gondor, and eventually leading the kingdoms of men in the War of Last Alliance against Sauron, while Farazon leads Numenor to ruin and destruction. Got all that? Well then with this new context, let's see what Rings of Power does with the story. We actually start off with Arondir running through the forest. He comes across a small group of orcs who are apparently deserting Adar's army. I don't have a big problem with the idea that Adar doesn't have full control over the orcs, but one of the deserting orcs comments, "I don't really care what they call us. Anything's better than freezing while helping Adar chase a ghost."
Anything's better than dying out Adar chase a ghost.
The ghost being Sauron, who they still believe is dead. But this is a problem, because the show has been telling us that Sauron is gathering strength, awakening and attracting evil from across Middle-earth. The Barrow-wights and the Balrog are two examples of this. If that is the case, then the orcs should be sensitive to Sauron's growing influence as well. How can they remain so ignorant so close to his presence?
This ain't right. All the pieces ain't welding together true.
One thing that I can say is that Rings of Power is consistently inconsistent. Arondir kills the orcs and decides to check their bodies. Lucky for him, the first one he checks has a scrap of paper on them with a rendering of a Region. Why would a random orc have this? So that Arondir can find it and learn where to go. I told you, the show would have random BS so its characters all wind up in the same place. And you know what that means. A bunch of forced BS is being laid out so that all of our characters will wind up in the same place again. But this is the only time we see Arondir in this episode, and we have no idea where Isildur, Theo, Estrid, or the Wildmen are. We jump to a Region where Celebrimbor is frustrated. He says the rings for men are defying him, as every attempt to make them has failed. Does this show really want me to believe they've just forgotten how to forge rings? I don't know, and neither do the writers. Celebrimbor orders his workers to try again, but they've run out of mithril. Celebrimbor loses his temper over this, and the elf girl says Celebrimbor hasn't seemed like himself lately. The Master Smith seems bewildered by this, and even forgets elf girl's name, so did I. So she reminds us that her name is Mardania. Celebrimbor sends everyone out of the room, as Anatar Halbrand Sauron comes in. Celebrimbor admits to him that he's been forgetting things, losing them. He chalks it up to fatigue, but Anatar Halbrand Sauron tells him that his people are asking for an audience. It seems he's been neglecting his duties for the rest of the city to focus on his rings. The smith doesn't want to talk to anyone though. He's become obsessed with making the rings that he believes will bring him some kind of salvation. He asks Anatar Halbrand Sauron to take care of the mithril problem. And all of this, they're going out of their way to show Celebrimbor falling apart. So Anatar Halbrand Sauron assumes leadership duties in the city. Mardania and a guard tell him that the usual flow of visitors into a Region has stopped. They sent guards to investigate, and only one returned. Well, he didn't really return. His body washed up on shore with a message carved into his chest. Wait, why did that not set off every alarm in the city? Why were they just waiting around to tell someone this? I don't know, but Annatar Hellbrand Sauron tells the guards to bury the body and tell no one. He also lies to Mordania that Celebrimbor doesn't want help from the elf workers anymore. He wants to work alone. Obviously, Annatar is isolating Celebrimbor, pushing him further into madness, which I question considering he's still relying on him to make the rings. Making the smith more unstable seems counterproductive, but that's just me. Anyway, Mordania wants to know what the message carved into the dead guard meant, as it was in a language she doesn't know. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron tells her it meant, "Where is he?" Hey, that's the name of the episode. In Adar's camp, Galadriel is sitting at a table with him. Adar says that Galadriel's obsession with finding Sauron was how he captured her. Galadriel tries to refute this by telling Adar that he submitted to Sauron, while she resisted, which isn't true. Adar rebelled and murdered Sauron. Galadriel helped him right into the heart of power, so she continues to be delusional. They talk about how Sauron corrupts people by granting them what they want. Adar says Sauron's lies are not what need to be extinguished, but Sauron himself, and he wants to help Galadriel with that. Galadriel wants to know what help he could possibly be, and I can't help but think, well, he's got an army. That could be helpful. Adar says he knows that Sauron is hiding in a Region, but how does he know this? Well, apparently Adar knew Halbrand was Sauron.
Halbrand is Sauron, isn't he?
That's why he had one of his orcs follow him to a Region. But if he knew this, why didn't he just kill Sauron instead of letting him go? Well, he says that the crown that he stabbed Sauron with was forged using some of the Cimmerils from Valinor. And no, that doesn't remotely make any kind of sense, but it does explain why Adar stabbed Sauron with it, hoping that it might have the power to kill him. And now he thinks the crown and Galadriel's ring together might be able to do so. That still doesn't explain why Adar let him go. He could have kept Sauron locked up until he found a way to get his hands on one of the elven rings. Though we don't know when he learned about those either, and never mind, I can't make this make sense. Adar tells Galadriel that the fate of the Region rests on her ability to set aside her pride. In Numenor, Elendil is on trial for inciting an uprising that caused loss of life. The only loss of life was Curly, who the Dork Kid Kinman stabbed through the back while unarmed. What is this, the January 6th committee? Anyway, Elendil is being charged with treason. Farzon says the charges warrant death, but because of his years of loyal service, he should be granted a reprieve, if he swears fealty to the rightful ruler, which Elendil does, only he doesn't recognize Farzon as the rightful ruler. He remains loyal to Muriel.
For Numenor's true ruler is now, and to the end of her days, Muriel!
He's led out of the hall, and someone suggests that the faithful be tried by the old ways to determine their fate. Back with the stranger, who is having visions of Nori screaming or being harmed or tortured or something, Not Tom continues to speak in riddles about the forces in the world that can teach people if they listen. He implies that these forces cannot be mastered, but they can be used. The stranger wants to know how, and Not Tom says he will show him, but not yet because we cut back to Nori and the stores, and I don't know what to say about this. It is mostly a bunch of wheel-spinning nonsense. Nori talks to the store's leader about moving because their village is no longer safe. She says that the Harfoots moved all the time, but the store's leader says that the village is more than just the place that they live. It is their home. Again, planting the idea of a home in Nori's head. We jump to Nori and Poppy talking. Poppy thinks that the people after them are only after him because they're after the stranger, and that if they find him, everyone could be in danger. No explanation on why they think that, but they decide to stay and fight. Fight who? The masked hunters apparently just left. They didn't take the stores prisoner, they didn't search the village, they didn't leave anyone behind to guard them. They just made some stern threats and then GTFO'd. But I guess they're coming back, and our little Harfoots think that they can fight to these guys.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for them.
Anyway, Not Tom and the stranger are walking along. It's time for the stranger to find his staff. How? Well, Not Tom leads the stranger to a valley of dead brush and says he will find his true staff when, and I'm not making this up, when the vision of his heart is single with the service of the secret fire. Now, Not Tom hasn't explained who or what the secret fire is, how the stranger is supposed to sync his heart up to it, or anything that could remotely be helpful. Of course, if you've read the books or watched the movies, you've heard this reference before.
I am a servant to the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor.
Which in turn is a reference to the creator being and his power of creation. It can also be read as the essence or life force that gives all sentient life its free will. But here, Not Tom is throwing it around as little more than a bad rendition of the Force, and it doesn't really work. It doesn't make sense to the stranger either. He's feeling pressed for time because he believes the vision he had, Nori and Poppy, are in danger, that they may be killed. And this leads to possibly the most egregious misappropriation of Tolkien yet. Not Tom feeds the stranger a line.
Many that die deserve life. Some that live deserve death.
Which is what Gandalf tells Frodo in Fellowship of the Ring. This is out of place, forced, and removes what little doubt I may have had about the stranger's true identity. So since this is delivered by Not Tom, the stranger will henceforth be called Pseudo Gandalf. The scene gets worse from here. Not Tom tells Pseudo Gandalf that his path is split into two, that if he leaves to save Nori and Poppy, he can never return to this path, the path of becoming a wizard to stand against Sauron and the Dark Wiz. And there's something awful familiar about all this.
Something very familiar about all this.
Yeah, Rings of Power is taking from its betters again. This time from Empire Strikes Back, when Luke has a vision of Han, Chewbacca, and Leia in trouble. Yoda warns Luke that if he abandons his train to go help them, he won't be able to return.
You must not go. Only a fully trained Jedi Knight, with the Force as his ally, will conquer Vader and his Emperor.
Not Tom tells Pseudo Gandalf that he must choose between saving his friends and his destiny.
Your friend or your destiny.
And then he disappears and leaves them alone. In Kazad Doom, the dwarves are mining mountains of gold. Prince Duren walks into the throne room and asks why his father has summoned him, but the king didn't. Anatar Halbrand Sauron did, who is now in Kazad Doom, somehow. Anatar Halbrand Sauron tells the Durens that Eregion is under threat of attack, and that the elves need more mithril to complete the remaining rings. Though you wonder why the dwarves would care about the elves making more rings. Good question. They wouldn't. But the king has become so consumed by his newfound greed for more gold that Anatar Halbrand Sauron thinks he has a bargaining chip.
I understand you are expanding your mining operations. We can provide a steady supply of timber to help build platforms, mine shafts.
But it doesn't work. King Duren says no. Then Anatar Halbrand Sauron sees a vision of the Balrog rising from one of the torches in the throne room. He pretends to acquiesce and leaves. The king tells his son he's only holding out. If war is coming to the surface, he wagers the elves will become more desperate for mithril, and the dwarves will be able to name any price they want for it. This leads Prince Duren to conclude the ring has had too much influence over his father.
Father, take off the ring.
Which he won't. Prince Duren tries to grab his father's hand, but the ring knocks Duren back several feet, something it can now do apparently. Then we're with Disa and Duren talking about what to do next. Disa wants to defy the king, but Prince Duren is struggling standing up to his father. In Numenor, Elendil's daughter visits the dungeon to make a final plea to her father. There are guys blowing horns to summon something called a sea worm. Elendil will then be thrown into the sea to face the trial by abyss. So if he is deemed innocent, the sea worm won't eat him. But if he is found guilty, then it will, I guess. The daughter says Elendil can still save himself by swearing allegiance to Farzon, but Elendil won't compromise his integrity. His daughter breaks down and says after everything she's lost, she doesn't want to lose him too. Maybe she should have thought of that before she betrayed him by throwing him with Farzon. But she's still a manipulative snake. See, she's gotten permission to go to Muriel. The former Queen Regent comes into the dungeon and orders Elendil to serve Farzon. She still believes that the island is better off with him, but Elendil doesn't, and he's sticking to his belief. And he repeats a line we haven't heard in quite some time. The sea is always right, and so he entrusts his fate to it. In Kazad Doom, a group of miners are headed to work, but Disa is blocking their path. They threaten to remove her by force, and she starts stone singing. And bats descend on them. Apparently her stone singing can summon bats now, and the group of strong, experienced dwarves are scared away by a few bats. Leaving aside how stupid that is, apparently the Rings of Power writers understand mining about as well as they understand smithing. Typically mines will have more than one shaft, so if Disa is blocking one, they could let her and just mine in a different place, or they could dig around her, so this shouldn't work. But we're back in Numenor, and it's time for Elendil to face judgment. However, before he can be cast into the sea, Muriel pops up. She says because Elendil was acting in her name, which he wasn't, but whatever, since he acted in her name, she can take his sentence for him. Elendil doesn't like it, but Muriel tells him that if they are to walk the path of the faithful, she must be the one to take the first step, and I don't think this makes much sense. I think mostly Muriel is having a crisis of faith. This is her way of testing if Farzon is the rightful ruler, or if the Valar are with her. So Muriel goes down into the water. A tentacle pulls her under so we can see how much budget they spent on a big CG monster thing. Above, Farzon is just about to declare her dead and guilty, when a surge of water spits Muriel back on land. Elendil declares her Queen of the Sea, a chant that is picked up by others. And as I mentioned before, this is all to speed up the Civil War storyline that will divide Numenor. After this, we see Farzon using the Palantir. But in the Seeing Stone, we catch glimpses of fire, Mount Doom, and Halbrand Sauron. So yeah, just as we knew, he's being corrupted. Or more corrupted. In Adar's camp, Galadriel has decided to work with the Orcs. She confirms Halbrand is Sauron, that he is in Eregion, crafting rings to dominate all of Middle-earth. Galadriel says Sauron won't escape until his job is done, only Sauron isn't making the rings, Celebrimbor is. And Sauron did leave Eregion to go to Kazad Doom, but again, I can't make this make sense. The writers are just inept. Galadriel thinks Sauron being tied to Eregion gives them an advantage, though she doesn't say what that is. She says that Elrond is coming with the elf army and bringing her ring with him.
As we speak, Elrond hastens from Lindon with an army of elves. And Nenya, my ring.
Though I don't know why she would believe that. Elrond has been against the rings, and her wearing one.
In choosing to wear those rings, you have all chosen to become his collaborators.
He took it from her to get it away from the Orcs and Adar, so there's no reason he would bring it back to them, right?
You didn't, did you? You didn't bring it, did you?
Well...
Anyway, Adar wonders what will happen after they defeat Sauron, what the elves will do to him and his orcs. But of course he knows the answer, and Galadriel just told him that her people are coming, and bringing with them the one thing he wants. And she doesn't even realize what she's done until after Adar calls her out on it.
Hoping I will reveal something.
You have already revealed everything. I hoped you would.
Galadriel really is the worst character I've ever seen in fiction. Okay, so realizing all this, Galadriel has a moment of insight. She rightfully calls out that Sauron has no army of his own. She suggests that Sauron has lured Adar and his people there for his own purpose, to place the orc army between himself and the elves. She says that Adar is playing right into Sauron's hands, which means so is she. Again, the orcs start moving. The guards in Eregion sound them warning, and Annatar Hellbrand Sauron is back in the city, and we see him cutting himself. Celebrimbor is still in his workshop, working on his designs for the Nine Rings. The alarms rile him from his stupor. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron tries to calm him down, but fails. He wants the smith to continue working on the rings, forgetting that they can't because they don't have Mithril. Celebrimbor heads outside to check on the city, but Sauron causes him to see a vision that everything is fine. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron claims that he's tried to forge the rings before and failed. He says he needs Celebrimbor to forge them for him.
I came to Eregion not because the Valar needed you, but because I did.
Which is yet another slight against the character and the lore, but I've lost count how many times they've done this. Anyway, Annatar Hellbrand Sauron has somehow smuggled highly refined, pure mithril powder out of Kazad Doom. How did he do that? Don't know, but he talks Celebrimbor into finishing his work on the rings, promising it will be his greatest legacy. As the episode ends, the attack on Eregion begins. And that is episode 6. The problems are only multiplying as the season drags on, and we are headed into the final 2 episodes, which will presumably cover the forging of the Nine Rings and the fall of Eregion. We start with Celebrimbor, looking out over a quiet city, enjoying a cup of elven tea or something. The sun is shining, and the smith looks more at peace than we've seen him in a long time. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron comes in to check on Celebrimbor's progress. The smith tells him that the past few weeks have brought him a focus he didn't know he could have.
These past weeks, I have felt such clarity.
Wait a second. Did he just say weeks?
These past weeks?
Weeks. They want us to believe that Celebrimbor has been working on these 9 rings for weeks? Didn't Adar start laying siege to the city in the last episode? The answers are yes and yes. But hold on to that confusion. This is the first of a few setups for something that's going to be revealed later in the episode.
When the world is still, then the ideas can flow.
For the moment, we see that Celebrimbor is still in Sauron's illusion that everything is right with the world. The bases of the 9 rings are finished, and the work will soon be completed. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron says that he'll be sad when their time together is over, but Celebrimbor says all things must end.
Oh, all things must end.
Anyone else just get hit with a wave of nausea? The writers are using lines like this to wink at the audience. They want us to know that they know that we know that things are about to go bad, and it's what some of us like to call a death flag. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron goes back outside, where sure enough the city is under attack, but it doesn't look like weeks worth of damage. He talks to a guard in Myrdania, where he assumes command of the city, lying that Celebrimbor has lost his mind and isn't able to do anything but work on the rings. Surprisingly, the guard guys accept this. Myrdania, however, still has questions. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron charms her and asks her for her support, promising she will be duly rewarded for her loyalty. Oh jeez. Over in the orc camp, and no, I'm not calling them Orcs, they're orcs. Adar tells his orcs that it's time. They reposition the catapults and fire them at part of the mountain outside the city, triggering an avalanche which falls just in the right way to completely dam the river. In the forge, Celebrimbor is making progress on the rings, but he's starting to notice things are wonky. Theonor's hammer is missing a gem. A mouse passes by his workbench twice, so there's a glitch in the matrix.
Oh, déjà vu.
Celebrimbor puts a black mark on a candle, presumably as a test, because he's becoming more aware of the weirdness around him. Then, in Kazad Doom, King Duren is told that an elf messenger has sent word that Eregion is under attack. The king takes a moment to wallow in self-satisfaction, certain that desperate elves will soon appear before his throne to beg for more mithril. King Duren wants the mines reopened, but his son and daughter-in-law are still camped out down there, blocking access. The king orders Narvi to open up the mines regardless of the cost, and we see Narvi and his workers heading into a confrontation. And just when it looks like they're about to throw down, the miners lay down their pickaxes and weapons. Apparently, hearing the king order them to fight his son and daughter-in-law was enough to convince Narvi that the old monarch had finally lost his mind. So instead of fighting, they side with the prince instead. Narvi tells Duren about the elf messenger, and Duren wants him brought into Kazad Doom to meet with him. But he's told that will be hard, since the elf has been banished in all dwarven lands. Meaning, yes, the elf messenger is Elrond. And that is interesting for a couple of reasons. For one, it means he is not hastening to Eregion with the elf army, as Galadriel told Adar. He's pacing around outside Kazad Doom. But also, given what happened last time Elrond was there, he's not going to be welcome. Based on what we've been told, the very sight of him could set off a riot. They're going to have to come up with a carefully planned, elaborate way to sneak him in, or they could just jump straight to having him inside.
That was easy.
Well, you can probably guess how this goes. After some playful banter, Elrond asks Duren to send his army to back up the elves at Eregion, and we cut away before Duren has a chance to answer. Meanwhile, the orcs begin their charge across the now dry riverbed and start the attack on the city walls. Britannia is walking along the battlements and spots something she calls a Ravager, some kind of siege weapon the orcs are pushing towards the wall. Laying aside for a moment that they don't explain what a Ravager is, I am more baffled that Britannia is on the wall. Why is she there? She's not a soldier, she's not a guard, she's not going to fight orcs. Why would they let her wander around the most dangerous place in the city? Well, there's no in-universe reason, but we all know what it is. Inside the forge, Annatar, Hellbrand Sauron returns to check on Celebrimbor's progress again. He's getting antsy about time. But Celebrimbor tells him that they apparently have all the time in the world. You see, he's been watching things in the workshop, and noticed the same mouse making the same movements on the loop. And as for the candle he marked, the mark is still there, which means the candle hasn't burnt down an inch all day. So you see, not only did Sauron trap Celebrimbor in an illusion, but he's also placed the forge in some kind of time anomaly. Time inside the forge has been looping, so that weeks have passed for Celebrimbor, while only a few hours have passed in the outside world. Yes, they actually want us to believe that Sauron is capable of doing this, and no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But this revelation has convinced the Smith that Annatar is not one of the Valar, because they wouldn't screw around with time like this. Annatar Hellbrand Sauron tries to talk his way out of this, but Celebrimbor loses his temper again, and throws Feanor's hammer at him, but then the hammer smashes a window, and just like that, Sauron's powerful spell is broken. Outside, the Smith can hear the sounds of the attack. Screams of frightened people. Racing to the window only confirms this, and Celebrimbor finally sees the truth of what is happening. The full revelation is too much, and he starts to break down and cry. And I really can't stand this character. He's been a mindless, gutless fool this entire series, and now he's a whining wretch too. Anyway, as Celebrimbor demands to know who Annatar really is, he knocks over the container of mithril, and discovers that it isn't really mithril at all. With the illusion broken, he sees that the container actually holds black goo. Like Sauron's black goo blood. Wait a minute. Show, are you actually trying to tell me that Sauron didn't smuggle mithril powder out of Kazad Doom? That instead he cast an illusion to make his black goo look like mithril? That Celebrimbor mixed Sauron's black goo with metal to forge the 9 rings for men? That's what you want me to believe? That black goo can be used in place of mithril to forge metal rings?
Is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
Okay, you know what? Screw it. We're so close to the end. Let's just keep going and get through this. Celebrimbor figures out that his partner isn't Annatar of the Valar, and he isn't Halbrand of the Southlands. He is in fact Sauron the Deceiver. The Smith flees from the forge and races to the battlements, where he tries to tell Mordania and the guards the truth, but they all think he's crazy, so they don't believe him. Mordania still has some pity for her old boss, so she tries to take him by the arm to lead him back to the forge. Celebrimbor yanks his hand away, and Sauron uses some kind of Jedi force push to knock Mordania off the wall, where she's killed by an orc. I guess that was her just reward for flirting with the devil. Sauron saddles up next to Celebrimbor and tells him to get back to work, or he'll lose everyone he cares about.
Finish the 9, and I will spare your city.
Below, the siege weapon has reached the wall. Orcs hammer anchor bits in place so the Ravager can tear chunks out of the wall. Next, Elrond has arrived with what looks like the whole elf army. So in the past few hours, Elrond has convinced Gilg Glad to send the army to Eregion instead of Mordor, rode to Kazad Doom to talk with Duren, then rode back to join the army and made it all the way to Eregion. Yeah, sure, why not? Next to full sensory illusions and localized time paradoxes, characters teleporting around the map is just about the easiest thing to accept in this episode so far. Anyway, the elf army and even Gilg Glad are there, but for some reason Elrond is the one commanding the army. How did that happen? We've been told more than once he's just a politician.
As you are so fond of reminding me, Galadriel, I am but a politician.
Since when is he a commander that leads an army? Since right now, I guess. So the orcs have lined up and the elves have lined up, and we get that epic scene from the trailer. The cavalry charges forward, and the scene might have worked to pull some emotion from me if it weren't for two things. One is the laughably bad post-coloring work, showing the elf side in bright sunlight, and the orc side in impossibly unnatural darkness, because the orcs can't stand the sun. But we don't see anything that could cast this dark of a shadow, so it just looks wrong. This show picks the strangest times to stick to the lore. The other problem is how this scene ends. We were baited at the beginning of the season with promises of a vast battle sequence that stretched over 2 episodes. They played up all the amazing action in store for us, and this epic charge should be the start of that. Only it's not. As the elves charge forward, the orcs wheel a covered cage into view and dramatically pull the cover off. Galadriel is all chained up with a sword at her throat, and Elrond stops the charge short. So instead of a battle, we get a parley between Elrond and Adar. Not sure why again it's Elrond negotiating with Adar and not Gilg Glad or one of his top lieutenants, but whatever. Adar offers to free Galadriel in exchange for her magic ring. Elrond claims that he didn't bring it and wouldn't give it up even if he did. Adar threatens that if Elrond chooses to fight, they will meet him on the field of battle carrying Galadriel's head on a pike. Elrond says that's basically okay with him, but before he leaves he wants to say goodbye. Adar lets him. And whoa, that's some goodbye. This show has been ripping off a lot of things, but I didn't expect to see MILF Manor in Rings of Power. If you guys didn't know, in the lore, Galadriel has a very alive husband, Celeborn, and they have a daughter named Celebrian, who Elrond eventually marries, making Galadriel Elrond's mother-in-law. So yeah, this isn't creepy at all. As they are leaving, Elrond is told that the orcs outnumber the elves 10-1, but Elrond isn't bothered by this, because he says that Duren is coming with the dwarves. All they need to do is hold out until daybreak. Of course, they say this as they're leaving the enemy camp, and any orc could have heard them. Doesn't seem very bright. In Kazad Doom, Duren is giving a speech to a whole bunch of dwarves. It's very inspirational and rallies everyone to join the fight. Cut with the speech, we see that Elrond slipped Galadriel more than a little tongue. He also gave her a lockpick. And Celebrimbor has gone back to the forge to work on the rings, because the script said so, I guess. But now the battle really begins. There's fighting, orcs are climbing ladders and getting into the city, while the Ravager thing continues to take chunks out of the wall. Adar returns to his tent to find Galadriel gone. She's covered herself in a tunic and is trying to sneak out of the camp.
What's with the...
It's my disguise.
I can see your face.
Not when I do this, you can't.
But she gets found out and is in trouble when Arondir shows up at just the right moment to save her, because they had to give him a win somewhere. Back in Kazad Doom, Prince Duren has already assembled the entire army and is ready to set out for Eregion. But before he can leave, Narvi runs up and says the king has gone full Jack Torrance and attacks some of the miners with an axe.
Here's Johnny!
Narvi says he's going to unleash the evil beast. Okay, so here's the thing. The ancient evil monster was a theory that Disa had after she heard something in that hidden cavern. Last we knew, Prince Duren was the only one who believed her. When did that change? I don't know, but Duren is told he has to call the army back. He has to stop his father, or he won't have a home to return to. But Duren doesn't need a whole army to stop one dwarf, even if it is the king. He could send the army ahead, but no, if Duren doesn't go, nobody does, apparently. Speaking of Eregion, Sauron is prodding Celebrimbor while he works, and we get the scene the writers have been hinting at. We finally get some insight into Sauron's perspective, but all it amounts to is a single conversation. Sauron says that he was tortured by Morgoth, which left him with some deep emotional scars. Sauron says Morgoth wanted to destroy everything, while he wants to heal it by using rings to manipulate and control all life on Earth. Yep, writers want you to believe that Sauron is really driven by a misguided sense of altruism, broken by emotional baggage, because he is, after all, just another victim. But Sauron is also a liar and a deceiver, and I don't know why we should believe a single thing he says. Anyway, Sauron leaves and Celebrimbor immediately throws the 9 rings into the fire in an attempt to destroy them. But of course that doesn't work. So the smith decides to make a run with the rings to get them away from Sauron. Unfortunately, he's been chained to his workbench and can't break the manacle, so in an act of ultimate desperation, Celebrimbor sacrifices his thumb. Ouch. Outside, he doesn't make it very far before he's knocked down by an explosion. But then Galadriel's there. Somehow she and Arondir found a secret way into the city that we've never heard of before, which is really convenient for them. I just hope the orcs don't find it. Galadriel intends to send Celebrimbor out the way she came in so that she can face Sauron. But the smith insists that she escape with the rings. He has to stay, because Eregion is his home. Celebrimbor says that part of him knew all along he had been working with Sauron, and he let himself be deceived, because he wanted what Sauron had promised. Galadriel agrees and admits she fell for the same deception. Now while it's nice that Galadriel finally admits this, it's also too little too late. And because this is Rings of Power, the revelation is delivered in the most annoying way possible, stating again more explicitly that our heroes are weak-willed idiots who are complicit in Sauron's rise to power. Celebrimbor then goes on a soliloquy about how strength doesn't overcome darkness. Light does. That doesn't sound nearly as inspirational as the writers think, and I have no idea what it means in this context. The orcs are about to breach the city. People are dying. Sauron is an arm's length from getting what he wants. How is light supposed to help here? Never mind. My bad for trying to make sense of this again. Outside the city, the battle is still going. They see the Ravager machine and move in to destroy it before it can tear down the wall. Jump to Sauron tearing the forge apart looking for the 9 rings, when Celebrimbor and a few guards return. Sauron kills the guards without trying and seizes Celebrimbor, promising to make him give up the rings. But back to the battle where Adar has finally unleashed the big guy. He picks his way through the battlefield, killing elves and orcs alike. He knocks Elrond several feet away, but it doesn't kill him. Because of all the characters here, Elrond is the one with plot armor. Arondir and Gilg Glad show up in just the nick of time to take the big guy down. Wow, all that build-up and anticipation, and he lasted less than 5 minutes. But there are more orcs who have regrouped and formed another charge. Our heroes are outnumbered. It looks like the end. Only the sun is rising. That means Duren should be arriving with a dwarf army. Just like the Rohirrim in the Battle of Helm's Deep, right? Actually, no, they don't. The dwarves aren't coming. Elrond can't accept that his friend is a no-show, and has a bit of an emo breakdown. He just kind of sits there while a bunch of his people are killed. But Adar does show up. Arondir tries to take him on and immediately loses. Did they just give my favorite pointless character a pointless death? I kinda doubt it, but we'll have to wait to find out, because this episode ends as the orcs break into the city, and we see Adar take Galadriel's ring from a defeated Elrond. So that's the penultimate episode. There's a lot going on here as it tries to wrap up all the disparate plot points. But the most impressive thing is how they baited us with the promotional material, promising a big 2-episode battle scene with an epic charge by the elves, when in reality, the charge ended not in battle but a conversation. The battle itself takes up about 17 minutes of this episode. That is how long the scenes showing the battle add up to if you put them all together. This action is disjointed and confused with no real idea of how the battlefield is laid out. That means characters jump from one area to the next, or conveniently pop up out of nowhere. There's no sense of where anyone is in relation to anything else. And it is basically over at this point. I'm not sure what they were counting as 2 episodes, except for maybe the start of the siege right at the end of episode 6. But believe it or not, this isn't the only thing they gaslit us about. Let's get into the finale and I'll show you. Episode 8 opens in Kazad Doom. Duren finds Disa looking after the men the king attacked. She says the ring has taken the king body and soul, because they have to remind us over and over why this is happening. They exchange a heartfelt moment and Duren heads out after his father. And I have to point out that Duren is alone. Why did he recall the whole army if he was going to confront the king by himself? There is no reason, just more forced contrivance. The king is down in a mine shaft, using a battering ram to break rocks. We see the impacts from the battering ram are sending thunderous shockwaves through the rock, and something is waking up. The prince yells out to his father to stop, and pleads with him to take off his ring again. This time the prince threatens his father that he'll take off his whole hand if he doesn't, but it's an empty threat. Instead, he has an emotional breakdown, and it turns out the prince is mostly talk with virtually no action. In his father's presence, Duren is little more than a boy in an adult's body. Of course, the king doesn't listen to his son's pleas, and with one final crack, he breaks through the wall. In the chamber beyond, the king proudly shows his son what he calls the dynasty of Duren, a massive deposit of mithril. But this is another wink and nod at the audience, because we know what's about to happen. The real legacy of Duren is unleashing the Balrog, which becomes known as Duren's Bane, since it brings his dynasty to an end. Sure enough, a fiery orange light rises up. Prince Duren cries out to run, just as the Balrog emerges. And in this moment, the king comes back to his senses. In an instant, he seems to understand and removes his ring of power. He tells his son that he's stronger than he thinks. And with that, the king lifts his axe and attacks the Balrog. The clash of the weapons sets off a shockwave that collapses the entrance to the tunnel. The king is dead. Long live the king. But he sacrificed himself to save Kazad Doom. No, really. That's it from the Balrog. That's the last we see of him this season. Even though we just saw the thing demolishing rock and stone like it was crepe paper, the tunnel caving in was enough to seal him away safely, at least for now. It's not a threat anymore. Yes, really. They've been teasing this bastard out for 2 seasons, and this is all we get. A fan service cameo.
What's all the racket?
What are you doing here?
A very brief cameo.
Me too.
Anyway, we're back with Pseudo Gandalf. It seems that he chose to save his friends over sitting around by himself to wait for Godot. And if you got that joke, we can be friends. Somehow, Pseudo Gandalf managed to find and wander right into the Stoor's village. I don't know how he did that, but the village seems to be deserted. Then the Dark Wizard appears. Dark Wiz expresses admiration at meeting Pseudo Gandalf and offers him everything that he's been searching for.
Your past, your name, even your staff.
Of course we know he's lying, because Not Tom told us that all those things cannot be given. Needless to say, Pseudo Gandalf isn't interested, but Dark Wiz doesn't want to take no for an answer. With a wave of his hand, the masked hunters appear with Nori and Poppy. So they did come back and capture the whole village. Guess their plan to put up some kind of fight worked about as well as we expected. The masked hunters threaten the Harfoots just like in Pseudo Gandalf's vision, and here the writers go off the map. The Dark Wiz is actually upset that the hunters are threatening the Harfoots. He says he doesn't want them harmed, but the masked guys say they want what Dark Wiz promised them. So the Harfoots are not being held hostage to coerce Pseudo Gandalf, but to threaten the Dark Wiz. This twist comes out of nowhere. We don't know enough about these groups to know what they want, what their motivations are, so there isn't enough context for any of this to make sense. Anyway, Dark Wiz sends the masked leader flying. He's impaled and killed on a piece of wood. The other masked dudes run away at this point, and that's it for them. Another antagonist that they've built up over the course of the season is just disposed of, but through some heavy-handed exposition, we find out that Dark Wiz wants Pseudo-Gandalf to join with him, so they can kill Sauron and take over as the Dark Lord. When Pseudo-Gandalf says no again, Dark Wiz destroys part of the village, and sends rocks raining down on everyone, but Pseudo-Gandalf's magic awakens and he's able to hold off the rocks while everyone runs. In Numenor, Elendil's daughter has summoned the leaders of the faithful to a meeting with Farzon, where the new king claims that Muriel survived her trial not because of the Valar, but because of Sauron, which he says means all of the faithful are now aligned with Sauron. Cue the montage of people being rounded up and arrested. Daughter goes to warn her dad that the guards are coming for him. Though shouldn't they have gone after Elendil first, locking up the leaders of the movement before rounding up random people on the street? Doesn't that make more sense? And never mind, I just answered my own question. Apparently, in a moment of conscience, the daughter distracts the guards so her father can get away. Elendil goes to see Muriel to tell her they have to leave Numenor, but Muriel is determined to stay. She says her place is on the island. And then she gives him a sword. Sorry, not a sword. The sword. Muriel gives him Narsil and tells him to go reclaim his destiny.
Reclaim your lordship, and with this sword, your destiny.
There is so much I could say about this and how little it works, but no. Moving on. The orcs are in Eregion, yelling and killing, everyone's dying, and no, I don't count this as part of the battle scene. The battle is over. This is just slaughter. Elsewhere, Galadriel pops out of the secret passage with a few elves, and surprise, the orcs have found it. But they didn't use it to enter the city, they just kind of camped out by it, waiting for someone to sneak out. And just like that, Galadriel is captured. Again. In the forge, Sauron shoots Celebrimbor full of arrows. But Celebrimbor won't give up the rings. He says the rings of power will be his downfall.
The rings of power shall destroy you.
Sauron loses his temper and kills the smith. Bye, Celebrimbor. You were a shadow of a better character. And after the utter fool you've been, I can't say I'm that sorry to see you go. For some reason, Sauron starts to cry about this. Do they really want us to believe that he's conflicted? Regretful? I don't know, but for all their attempts to make Sauron a complex and sympathetic character, all they've really done is make him a weak, pathetic, emotionally fragile beta male with schizoaffective disorder. This is not Sauron. A group of orcs breaks into the forge while Sauron's having his moment. Glug is leading the group, which is a bit of surprise. See, in the last episode, Glug wasn't happy about how things were going. He wanted Adar to withdraw and lead the orcs home. As the rest of the orcs charged into battle, he hung back, refusing to fight. Yet now he's leading one of the first waves of orcs to enter the city, but they're setting something up here, because Glug is looking for Sauron, and you can probably guess why. We cut to Isildur and Theo. Apparently they're back home in the Numenorian settlement. They have a heart-to-heart bonding over their dead moms. Then Estrid comes in, and it's awkward. Outside, the dork kid Kinman arrives at the settlement with a bunch of guards. He declares the settlement is now a Numenorian fortress under his command. And then Isildur walks up, and we get another awkward scene, where Kinman pretends to be friendly at first, before pulling Isildur aside and telling him his dad is now wanted for treason. At Eregion, we see that Gilg Glad and Elrond have been captured. And so is Arondir, who's still alive, somehow. In a forest outside of Eregion, the orcs bring Galadriel to Adar. Why is he off in the woods alone? Well, Adar is wearing Galadriel's ring, and it's healing him. He is regaining some of his elfiness. Adar gives Galadriel her ring back. He wants to kill Sauron and afterward promises to take the orcs back to Mordor. He hopes the rings will heal the rift between them, or something like that. They are interrupted by orcs carrying Glug on a mat. They tell Adar that he was wounded by Sauron. When Adar goes to check on Glug, the orc stabs Adar, and the rest join in, taking turns stabbing their father to death, in a way that is meant to parallel the betrayal of Sauron in the first episode. So yeah, Adar's dead, possibly the most interesting antagonist in the show, and they just threw him away for a pointless plot twist they didn't earn. Sauron emerges from behind a tree before telling the rest of the orcs to destroy Eregion, and they obey him because now they're under his control for some reason. Galadriel attacks Sauron, and it's painfully obvious that she's no match for him. She's been waiting thousands of years for this moment, to take on Sauron, to destroy him, and she doesn't stand a chance. Sauron makes himself look like Halbrand again, then he looks like Galadriel, so she's basically fighting herself. Then he looks like Celebrimbor. Sauron is trying to throw her off, and it works because she's an idiot. Galadriel loses control of her anger, and though she manages to get a couple hits in, Sauron stabs her with a crown. She falls, and Sauron takes the 9 rings. Things are looking pretty bad, except that we know Galadriel can't die, just like we knew Sauron would get the 9 rings, so there's no drama in this at all. This is just going through the motions with extra steps. Anyway, the dwarves finally show up. Better late than never, I guess. They fight off the remaining orcs and save our core cast. They find Galadriel near death. Gilg Glad tries to heal her using his ring, but it's not enough. Elrond finds Galadriel's ring and puts it on so they can heal her together. But we don't see that. Instead, we cut to the Harfoots and the Stoors. The Stoors aren't going to rebuild their village. They are packing up to leave it instead, and Nori and Poppy have decided to go with them. Pseudo-Gandalf comes back, and the Stoors start calling him Grand Elf.
Thank you kindly, Grand Elf. Goodbye, Grand Elf.
It gets repeated several times, leading to the second worst reveal in the series so far. The first was when it turned out that Halbrand was Sauron, but this is right up there with it, because the stranger, the Grand Elf, is indeed Gandalf.
Gandalf. That's what they're going to call me, isn't it?
Yeah, this is not a surprise, but I'm going to stick with my nickname anyway. Pseudo-Gandalf finds a random piece of wood in the rubble. It's his staff, and then he goes back to see Tom Bombadil. The dwarves are back in Kazad Doom to have a funeral for the king. Isildur is getting ready to sail back to Numenor. Muriel is in chains. And Elendil is running away, just like in his vision. Galadriel awakens all healed up in a scene that's clearly meant to emulate when Frodo awakened in Rivendell. And sure enough, the place where the survivors of the battle have gathered is meant to serve as the founding of Rivendell. The elves have to decide whether they will attack Sauron again right away, or bide their time to heal and regroup. Galadriel quotes Celebrimbor, that light, not strength, overcomes darkness, which doesn't answer the dilemma, but the show acts like it does, and on that note, the second season of Rings of Power ends. It's been an impressive cavalcade of garbage. The writers disrespected the source material, reducing it to Easter eggs and callbacks. They wasted our time with boring, meandering plot filler. They assassinated several characters, especially the men, by turning them into emotionally fragile wimps. Sauron is supposed to be a master deceiver, but in Rings of Power, our characters admit that they allowed themselves to be fooled. They wanted to believe Sauron's lies. So it's not that Sauron was strong so much as that our good guys are weak. And that is because the writers are weak, and they can't think of another way to depict the rise of the Dark Lord. This messy application of the plot screws up the characters and results in a lack of investment, which makes most of the dramatic moments land with the impact of a wet diaper. Once again, Rings of Power is not Lord of the Rings. It is a vanity project made by media illiterate activists. It is a bad fan fiction, and unlike Tolkien's work that has lasted over 7 decades, Rings of Power will not be remembered a few years from now. It is a legacy written in the sand. But that's just one Rebel's opinion. What are your thoughts on Rings of Power Season 2? Let me know in the comments. Like the video and subscribe to the channel so you'll get all the latest updates from Rebel Normal.